The Autobiography of an Idea by Sullivan. We are on chapter 8 and 9.
Yep.
And this is where he meets his teacher, first great teacher. So I'm very excited about this one. So it's going to be Sherri Tracinski, followed by Maritza, Rob, and then Rupali. All right, so let's get started. Sherri, the floor is yours.
All right. So we are missing today. We are missing Joia today because she is traveling. Am I right?
That's correct.
Okay. She might have a few things to say when we get back because there's a lot of poetry involved in this section. So I was really happy that this week we were going to double up a little bit on chapter 8. We a few of us touched on it last week. But there was so much in chapter 7 that we decided to go ahead and readdress chapter 8 and 9 this week. And I know Shrikant's, I like to politely disagree with him whenever I can. He talks about this is when Sullivan meets his great teacher. There's actually more than one. I mean, yes, he sees Moses Wilson as his one great teacher, all in caps, but we're learning a lot also from his other teachers in chapter 8. So I'm going to start here in chapter 8 with a couple of different things. And remember how Shrikant started this whole discussion out with this quote. Can you put it in the chat again, Shrikant? That this is the time when Louis Sullivan, we're talking in the earliest chapters about this time when there is a breaking in and a breaking out. And these 3 chapters really, last week's, this week's, and the two chapters we're talking about this week are really where a major part of who is Louis Sullivan is starting to form. We are getting in these chapters Sullivan's learning to love learning. And we get in these chapters his joy of living, which is so critically important, and his joy of buildings and the built environment. And he really, we know Sullivan has had this deep love of nature since his earliest childhood. We see that in the very first chapters, but it becomes crystallized in a way that is really important to who young Louis Sullivan is. And I wanted to talk first here about this, this young child, his grandfather here admits he's a sheltered child, is yearning to get out into the bigger world, to see what he can see. And he noticed this happens in the chapter before the very end of it, or is it the beginning of this one? I think it's the beginning of this one where he pushes, he works really hard to be included on this trip. In the Montessori world, we call this a going out. And he pushes for this trip with everything he's got. And his grandfather finally relents and says, okay, I'll take you. He finally realizes, no, this child needs to get out there and see the world with his own eyes. Remember the last week we saw him moving from South Reading to Boston, and Boston's the big city by this point in his mind. So there's a growth that happens there. And now he wants to burst further out and see even more. And I love some of what it is that he is desperate to see. And we're going to start here with the Berkshires. So he starts here so excited about this trip to see the Berkshire Hills. His argument with his grandfather is, I have never seen a real waterfall. And so we start here when he says the hour came, and the hour is italicized, counting down the hours to this bursting forth that he gets to do on this trip. He entered the foothills and began winding among them. Remember, he's on a train here. As with labored breath, the engines, like a heavy draft horses, began a steady pull, the train dragging reluctantly into steadiness as succeeding hills grew taller, with Louis eagerly watching. The true thrill of action began with the uprearing of imposing masses as Louis clung to the solid train, now purring in the solitudes and ever lengthening swings, deep valleys below, until amid mists and pale moon gleaming arose the mighty Berkshires. Their summits faint and far, their immensity solemn, calm, seemingly eternal in the ghostly fog, in a mild shimmer, clad in forests, uttering great words, runic words, revealing and withholding their secret to a young soul moving as a solitary visitant. Even as a wraith among them, the engines cry, "We will," the mountains replying, "We will," to an expanding soul, listening within its own midst, its own shimmering dreams, to the power without and within, amid the same echoes within and without, bereft of words to reply, a bare hush of being, as though through mists of mind and shimmer of hope, sublimity in revelation had come to one wholly unprepared, had come to one as a knock on the door, had come to one who had known mountains only in books. And Louis again, in wonder, felt the power of man. This is a hugely important element in Louis Sullivan's life. He sees this power not only in man who's creating this train that climbs the steep into the mountains. He sees this also in nature, as we'll see in the next segment here. We'll see his love of nature in much the same way. It's also a power. And he says here, the thought struck deep that what was bearing him along was solely the power of man, the living power to wish, to will, and to do. And then he has this epiphany, and he writes that man in his power with a broad stride had entered the regent sanctity of these towering hills like a giant of Elfinland, had held them in the hollow of his hand. He had made the path, laid the rails, builded the engines that others might pass. Many saw engines and rails and pathways, and one saw what laid behind them. In the murky mist and the shimmer of moon and dawn, a veil was lifted in the solitude of the Berkshires. So here is, remember, this is young Louis Sullivan, who is the one who sees what others do not see. This is the veil lifting, where Louis Sullivan is seeing everyone else is on the train. They're just taking the train. Louis Sullivan is seeing that behind that veil of what is the train ride, he is seeing the power, the creative impulse that was necessary to make that ride happen. And for a young boy, that's extremely powerful and moving. And then he comes into Albany. And I love this part. They reached Albany in broad daylight. The Hudson, to Louis's dismay, did not impress him as greatly as he had hoped and believed that it would. Its course was straight instead of broadly curving, and the clutter, I love the words, the clutter of buildings along its western flank seem to belittle it. So here again, notice it's not only the nature, it's the built environment that is speaking to him. It appeared to him as a wide waterway, not unpleasant of its kind. It seemed to lack what Louis had come to believe the character of a river. The bridge crossing it, with its numberless short spans and lack of bigness. I love that. It's a lack of bigness. It's not small. It's a lack of bigness. And think about that. There's a big difference in those two ideas. There is something that's small, maybe puny, little, whatever. But then there's a lack of bigness. So Louis has now come to the point where grand, big gesture, deep, meaningful things are now normal to him. And he comes across this bridge, and his complaint is its lack of bigness. And this is really, really important to him. And continues, it's the lack of bigness, beauty, and romance. He gazed upon it in instant disdain. This is a visceral reaction he's having. It appeared to creep, cringing and apologetic across the wide waters, which felt the humiliation of its presence. He's talking about the water feeling humiliated by the bridge. This is where we get Louis Sullivan, who has buildings speaking to him. The bridges are too. The river is. Yet he received a shock of elation as the train had moved slowly along the bridge, carrying him with it. And as he gazed downward upon the flowing waters, again, he marveled at what men could do, at the power of men to build a bridge so strong that it could carry the weight of a great train, even with his own precious and conscious weight added thereto. And he mused about the bridge. Why was it so mean, so ugly, so servile, so low-lived? Why could not a bridge perform its task with pride? Why was not a proud bridge built here? Was not New York a great state? Was it geography called the Empire State? Was not Albany the capital city of that state? Why so shabby an approach? Was not the broad Hudson figuratively a great aqueous frontier? I mean, look at that. A river described as a great aqueous frontier between Massachusetts and New York, each state proud in its sovereignty. And was not this bridge a presumptive greeting between these sovereign states? I'm going to skip a little ahead here and read this part. And there came up to him also the saying, by their fruits ye shall know them. As lost in imagery, he visioned forth the great Bay State, saluting the great Empire State, saying solemnly, the sovereign state of Massachusetts greets the sovereign state of New York. And in his mind, he's reading, let this noble bridge we herewith present you be a sign and a bond. The bridge as a sign and a bond of everlasting enmity between us. And thus Louis, ruminating rather fiercely, wished to know what was behind the pestiferous bridge. It's now gone from ugly and servile and low-lived, and now he's worked his way up to the pestiferous bridge. He keenly felt that man's amazing power to do should, in all decency, in all reason, be coupled with romance in the deed. And even more keenly, he felt as his eyesight cleared that this venomous bridge, he's brought it up yet another level, to be a betrayal of all that was best within himself, a denial of all that was best in mankind. And this experience of this bridge is, and I'm going to use the pun here, a watershed moment in young Sullivan's life, because he makes this connection, this visceral reaction of that sense of life reaction to, well, just get across, however you got to go, whatever. He has such a visceral reaction against that milling about, that sort of mediocrity, that sort of, oh, just do whatever, the least amount. That is so against who he is and what he's about that it just aches in his heart. And this is where I think this idea of what this joy of living needs to be reflected in the built environment and everything that you do. And when he finishes this tour, he ends up meeting his cousin, Millie.
Before you go into that, I want to spend
Yes.
a couple of minutes on this bridge.
Yes, I could spend lots more minutes on the bridge. The great pestiferous bridge.
The thing that really struck me in this description is how fluidly he goes between individual and society, like the states, between kind of these social relationships and then aesthetic relationships, and then ethical, and then epistemological, and then metaphysical. So he, in this description, he's actually going between these things in a very fluid manner, which is very unusual. And he sees it. He sees this is the way in which state of New York is greeting state of New Jersey. Why? What is the appropriate way of doing that?
Yeah, I mean, he's complaining essentially that these two great states are giving a damp, sweaty, limp handshake.
Now, I want to add something else in here, because it's something I remember from about 19 years ago when they were starting to do the rebuilding for the World Trade Center in New York City.
Yeah.
And they were coming up with plans, master plans for what they're going to build there. And somebody got an article published in the New York papers about how we need to build back tall, big, something tall and grand. This lady over here, but also at the time there was a master plan they come up with. It was a bunch of like 40 or 50-story buildings, and somebody came up with a great dismissive line. It said, "It looks like Albany." It was like, here's mid downtown Manhattan, this major center of commerce, so you're giving us something that looks like Albany. So I think this problem with Albany goes back a long time of it being an uninspiring place. Let's put it that way.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sherri.
Yes. And then before we get to Minnie, actually, we need to talk a little bit about the Mohawk Valley. And this is when he is coming around. This is, again, more of his trips on this fantastic railway. Rob was reading on the way. I can't recall where this line is, but Rob was reading this out loud in the car on our way here, talking about how on this train journey, Louis Sullivan has his head out the window so much of the time. And of course, this is a coal burning train. So he's besooted, covered in begrimed.
I'll find it.
Oh,
you keep talking.
Well, yeah, but I'm talking right here and you're taking my book.
Well, I know, but I'm just gonna find this.
Okay, so he's like the dog in the car whose head's out the window, ears are flapping in the wind, tongue hanging down, eyes brilliantly lit, just having the best time ever. I'm gonna need my book.
Okay, I can't.
They got it. Begrimed, not besotted.
I think it's begrimed because of the fixed idea he had that the proper place for his head was outside
the window of the train. So as he's continuing, he's left the pestiferous bridge in Albany, and he's moved on to the Mohawk Valley. And here, this is what I love about this is I have the original copy of this that I got probably 18. And I don't know where I got this green pen, but I can tell in all of the books that I read when I first started college that when I underlined things, they were in green pen, and I can identify essentially that was my first 2 years of college. Then the pen is gone and the colors get underlined in different ways. But I love that I come back to the very same passage that was underlined in green pen way back in the 80s. And he writes here about the Mohawk Valley. He ranged with his eyes from near to far, following the sweep of valley floor from the Mohawk to the distant low-flowing hills, and to and fro carelessly, as mile after mile of valley passed by, and again mile upon mile, Louis's peaceful mind passed into wonder that such an open world could be. And now he marveled, not at man's power and his works, but at the earth itself. And a reverential mood claimed him for its own as he begun in part to see with his own calm eyes what Mother Earth in her power had done in her varied moods, and to surmise as best he could what more she had done that he knew not of. So there is where that crystallization happens of nature. He's been in it and has loved it all of his life, but this is where it's a click in his head when he sees nature itself as a power and knows now that he has seen such new adventures on this train ride, that there is so much more out there that he doesn't yet know. And there's this sense of this grand opening for him. Then we get Minnie, his lovely cousin, who there is this wonderful relationship. I love that when we hear about the meeting of Minnie, I don't know if you guys all noticed this, the description of all of his time with Minnie is she took him. Every single thing. And I actually started underlining the tooks. And the next day she took him to church. And then we have another.
It's italicized, isn't it?
And she took Louis by her hand, and over we hear this use. And I don't think it ever occurred to me before this reading, but remember, Minnie is 18 and Louis is 14. So she's in a different world, really. She's burgeoning into society. She's sadly told she can no longer climb trees. That's just crushing. I mean, really, I wouldn't do it. But she finds this kindred spirit with Louis. And she knows that, like Louis's grandfather, knows you don't want to mess too much. You want to let it come out. So she's very, very careful to not step on his feelings, to let those things happen. But she's also very much the guide in this. And if you get a chance to reread it yourselves, start noticing that it's not we went, it's she took. And I love that many years later, in his memory of this is how he portrays it, that he was being brought to these experiences and shown things in this very gentle way. And she is teaching him so many things about how to think about the world, how to see the world. She is explaining to him veils. I mean, we just had this description of the veil a minute ago, of the veil being lifted from Louis's eyes. She explains that about society. She talks this, I mean, it's just crushing to read, that she's talking about all of the men that she has as potential suitors, not of one of which she would be remotely interested in. And these are where Louis Sullivan is learning that the same spirit he sees in what is a good bridge and a bad bridge, and what is a good river, lazy, boring, or what's a good waterfall, that same thing happens in society too. And one of the things here, let's see, where was I? Oh, we took that part. I lost my page here, Minnie. I was looking for all the tooks and I lost my page. Hang on a second. I missed the Lion Falls. And one of the things that I love about this memory of Minnie is his description of her physically when we first get hit. And he says here, and Louis thus taken thus unawares, and thus caressed with words, dared at last to look into the gray Scotch eyes that seemed endowed with an endless fund of merriment, of badinage, thank you, of joy, of appeal, of kindness, and saturated with an inscrutable depth beyond all of these. He gazed steadily at her tender face, narrow, tapering, slender, and very pale, delicately freckled, at nostrils trembling, at the wide, thin-lipped, super-sensitive mouth, at large ears, at thin, vagrant, dark, sandy hair, at a sprightly medium figure, all alive. She was clad in dark blue silk. He found in her not beauty, but irresistible, pervading charm. So the detail that he remembers is so exquisite. But it's the more deep thing that I see that's important. It's not that he sees her immediately as beautiful. It's her charm. It's her mind that he's connecting with. And that's a really important thing for Louis Sullivan. And I love this joy of living. I love that they go wandering off into all kinds of wonderful mountain views and along the rivers. And they have this stone outcropping that she refers to as their pulpit, where they talk deep discussions about things. And they sat for a while by the falls, but Louis was not content. There seemed to be something purposeless in this clumsy trundling about of dark waters, losing their balance, falling helplessly over ledges and worn boulders, lost in their way among them, and reeling absurdly off at the bottom. It seemed to lack order and singleness of purpose. Near the falls was a small wooden mill afflicted with the rickets. And this alone seemed to in tune with the falls. So he's having this discussion with Minnie, and he's critiquing the waterfall and its lack of purpose, and its kind of lost, meandering way, and noticing that this small little wooden mill afflicted with rickets. I mean, we all know rickets, right? You can imagine the sort of bow-kneed, knock-kneed, kind of perched on the edge of I'd be afraid to step inside that it might collapse. We stayed at a place with steps like that just recently. That was steps with rickets. So even, and I'm sure they're talking about this between the two of them, and she is noticing this, and their like sense of it is just inflaming the fire in one another to think more in this way, to reach deeper in this way. And then at the end, and I love Minnie's tenderness and knowledge of what she's doing to Louis. And then suddenly, after much of this discussion, Minnie says, then suddenly coming to herself, she cried, "We must go back to the house at once. If we're late at supper, your auntie will give me just one look, and I'll know exactly what that one look will mean, but you won't." And she took Louis, there it is again, by the hand, her books under her other arm, resumed her jaunty mood, and led him to the house, delivering to his auntie a human package, not merely stirred, but churned into butter and whey. So we have quite an important part of Louis Sullivan's life is this summer he spends with his cousin, Minnie. It is just a dear, dear, wonderful thing. So she becomes one of his teachers, not the teacher. That's another thing that comes, and I'm going to leave that for you, Shrinkan, because I know you're going to have a great time at it. And what, this one here?
She made him feel he was not.
Oh yeah, and I know that this is something that Rupali will probably talk about too, but I'll pass this one on to you, Rupali. And this, what I love this about it. This is the one little paragraph that talks about why Louis loves Minnie as a teacher. Minnie became Louis' precious teacher. She made him feel he was not being taught, but entertained with gossip. She knew that what she had she said in persiflage. I see sometimes I have to get pronunciation over here. She knew that what she had said in persiflage would later sink in deep, and she knew why it would do so. So that is what I love about that chapter, which is why I thought it was so important that we give that whole chapter 8 another chunk of time this week, because we're seeing, I think, the beginning of Louis Sullivan. The chapter before this was the beginning of the love of building. And this becomes the beginning of the disdain for not living up to your best self, almost, and then we have, and I'm going to leave this for the rest of you, but I'm going to just start it by saying we have Louis Sullivan jumping into high school. And this was a really fun chapter for me to read. I'm not sure about you.
I haven't got.
Because we have a young one who is about to enter high school on Wednesday. And there is in this chapter where he gets to meet this wonderful new teacher. Not the very best of teachers, it doesn't have to be, but it's a teacher that shows him a different world of taking this idea of pushing yourself to be the best you can. And he takes that lesson, I think, much better than we hear his other students do, his other classmates do. I just love that when he gets to that description, the beginning of what school, this high school experience is going to be, that the description is that Louis writes, Louis was amazed, thunderstruck, dumbfounded, and overjoyed. He had caught and weighed every word of it as it fell from the lips of the master. To each thrilling word, he had vibrated open-eyed, amazed response. And at the end of this particular paragraph, he writes, at last, a man. So here it's not just that somebody is teaching him the things he doesn't know, it's that he's learning what that is, what it means to be a man. And you notice that We don't get this from his father. We've talked about this before. He has kind of a strained relationship. There are parts that he loves about what his father brings, and there's parts that he really doesn't. But while we hear in this chapter that he doesn't have a fondness and a love for the man of the teacher, he has a great admiration for his skill as a teacher. And so with that, I'm going to pass it on.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Sherri. And thank you for advocating for chapter 8 and
Yes.
doing a great job of capturing it. Thank you. Next up is Maritza.
I'm actually also really grateful. Can you guys hear me okay? So I'm really grateful that we did chapter 8 here, because I had not read chapter 9 last week, and reading chapter 9 and then knowing that I would have the opportunity to speak on those chapters simultaneously was really exciting, just because the juxtaposition of the two of his first teachers. So a couple things that I want to share is like just some things that I saw in those two aspects of the two chapters, things of Louis Sullivan and realizations. Is the first is these are the first people to whom or of whom he's aware of an actual purposeful teaching, which I think is like important. It's kind of like a turning point for him. And also it's the social aspect. These are remembered teachers in such that they shone a light for him of things about which he was previously unaware. And the manners in which it was done was vastly different for each one, but he respected both of them for entirely different reasons. And so that was it was interesting to me to see how with Minnie, it was almost as though it was a whirlwind. And what that made me think of, it's kind of like if you can recall your first like best friend. If you're somebody who tended to have your nose in a book when you were younger, your first like true best friend probably would have also been when you were around hitting puberty, like he was. And so you're old enough to have that very vivid memory of the unfurling of that relationship, and it holds a special spot in your memory bank. And that's kind of the way I viewed his just the sharpness with which he remembered some of the things about Minnie. And I think it's also the absolute pleasure of having people in your life who are constantly a learning experience for you. That's kind of what I saw there. I will say something else I saw in these two chapters that I really enjoyed was the outside point of view of the grandfather. But then you have to remember it's not actually outside, because this is an autobiography. So it's written in such a manner so as to give us the illusion that it's coming from outside of Louis Sullivan. But this is the way when I think of the grandfather's thoughts when he's looking at his grandson that we read in these two chapters, it occurs to me that what they are actually retrospective commentary that Louis is making upon himself at that age, which I find to be so fascinating. Like just like in chapter 8, when the grandfather is like, but this I like, he says, oh, I see this bit of him, and this is surely his father, and this bit of him, this is surely his mother, my beautiful daughter. And he goes, but gosh, this part, that's none of us, and that's purely him. And it both amazes and frightens him. And then when I read that the first time, I somehow magically forgot that this was actually Louis Sullivan who's writing this. But it wasn't until chapter 9 where the grandfather is really sad at Louis' lack of interest in certain aspects of New York, that the grandfather would have liked him to have that joy of living that he saw in so many other aspects of Louis Sullivan's life. He wanted to see that. And it struck me I actually went back and reread the chapter 8 because I remembered in that moment, oh, this is Louis Sullivan. So we're actually getting to see how Louis is, you know, in hindsight, viewing himself at that age. And it made me stop and consider similar moments in my life at that age. Like, how would I view if I were looking at it from a perspective of somebody who would have been, I didn't have any grandparents, so I don't actually know if I could really put myself in that situation. But if I were to do so, that it's that thought of someone looking at you from somebody who is close to you, who loves you dearly, who looks at you and sees so much that is great, but can also see you with a true enough lens, whereas they see bits of you that are lacking, and it saddens them. And it's a really interesting thought experiment. It's easier to be like, okay, these are the things I can see that I improved upon, and so I'm guessing those were holes when I was younger. And I hope it comes up more in some of the other chapters, because I really find that to be the grandfather is the one pointing out almost like the self-doubts that the boy Louis himself would have harbored without him knowing that they were like, they're not, I don't know, doubts maybe is the wrong word, but maybe even flaws, like undeveloped aspects of one's personality that we ourselves are incapable of seeing. It's really interesting to see them here when one remembers that this is an autobiography, because that level of introspection is just, it's amazing. And I don't think most of us ever, think that deeply about ourselves. Anyway, so that was an aspect of these two chapters that I found to be just really enticing to me, just that level of critique of one's own self, as it were. And also, again, I have to say, the writing, the manner in which it's done is, this is some amazing writing. I am in love with his style of writing. I really am. It's like, I don't know if any of you sew, but if you're sewing a silk, it's like the finest little stitch. It really is. This is an amazingly done thing. But anyway, sorry. So I didn't mean to harp on that for so long. But so here, he doesn't, by the way, he also doesn't ever speak of his grandfather as a teacher. The grandfather's outside the realm of these great teachers for Louis Sullivan, which I find to be interesting, because you see how the grandfather is a very careful teacher throughout all the previous chapters, and these including. So those are, he doesn't, these Minnie and then the teacher, I don't know, I guess, are we holding off on this for you, Shrikant? Are you wanting to get into this one? What struck me about when he went to high school and he sat in this classroom and had a teacher, he calls him master, which I find to be fascinating, in that he gives a level of prowess to this teacher that he then moves forward to tell you was immaterial whether or not he was like the best teacher. But it's fitting, and it frames it for us in a way that there leaves no doubt that this child sitting in this classroom finally was fed something that he had hungered for. And it's the idea of, and to me what resonated is that when we are young, there really are very few people with whom we interact who give it to us straight, as it were. Like, it's such a breath of fresh air. And even now as we're adults, there's so much camouflage around so many interactions, that to sit down and have somebody tell you A is A, B is B, and these things are gonna happen. You're not gonna like these things, but these are the things gonna happen. I can almost hear in between the words that he's writing, that just a huge sigh of like contentment at being given this like just straight up, honest truth. And I think that, I mean, I can empathize with that because it's just not something, it doesn't happen that often now as adults, and it surely is not something I encountered almost ever as a child. But it almost also felt like this amazing teacher also was giving enough room for him not to get the appropriate lessons out of it. So it's even more amazing that he did get them. Like, it was because the professor said, I'm putting this is what my goal. And I love that this teacher said to him, I'm going to give everything I have to you. And I expect you to give everything you have to me. And that's so rare. It's really rare. And it's such an entirely different approach to Minnie's approach, because Minnie is just giving him she's spoon feeding small little tidbits. And, you know, through her, he learns about social interactions. But that's also something, what I like, the piece that is most interesting to me about Mosley is that it's that perspective that Louis describes on culture. And frankly, when he brought it up, it was a shock to me. And I was like, how do you figure? And then he told me. And it's so just beautiful. As like there's a professor standing in front of you, giving you these rules that you're gonna have to follow for the rest of the class, and they are really stark and really strict. And he sits there, and after he's like, he's dumbstruck and all this, and he speaks on the topic of culture. And I'm sorry, because I thought I had marked it, and right here. So he says, he arose from his seat and asked Moses Wilson what culture really meant, and was told it signified the genius of a people, of a race. And what was meant by the genius of a people? It signified their innate qualities and powers of heart and mind, that therefore their culture was their own expression of their inmost selves as individuals, as a people, as a race. Louis was magnificently bewildered by this high concentration. He seemed to be in a flood of light which hid everything from you. And first of all, that's an amazing description of culture. It really is. And it's beautiful. And I get why Louis was kind of, I'm just gonna go hide in this corner here so you don't see that, I'm actually burning, brain cells here trying to grasp this. But that paragraph to me was the most impactful one of this 9th chapter. He got so much out of Moses, his professor, this master. But this definition, and it's the fact that he got up and he asked a question and he got an answer that was so profound for him that it left him sheepish. Because we have seen so many flavors and aspects of Louis the Child in the previous chapters, but sheepish, that's not an aspect of him we've seen before. But it makes me think of in a group that I do in our Thinker Society, as she can't, we have said before, and Joe and I make the joke, and even CJ, is that one of our favorite things is to leave a discussion with more questions than when we arrive. And that's what this came to mind. And to me, that's what I hear as that is the what do you say, the rule for a great teacher. You know, when he leaves you with more questions and things to ponder. And I have to say, this definition of what culture really means. But then, because I reread this maybe 1,000 times in the last couple of days, but then you have to realize that Louis himself may not have been able to pose the question had it not been for this teacher. And then you're kind of, again, you yourself find yourself teacher. I feel like I'm all over the place. Sorry, guys. But I felt that I could visually see in these two chapters, and most specifically in this 9th chapter with this master teacher, the forming. I think even Louis Sullivan says it, that there is he talks about, yes, this, he talks about a formless boy being shaped. And that's exactly what it is. And the shaping was almost, I'm not sure, somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Did he met Minnie before he met the master teacher? Right, okay, that's what I felt. So Minnie began the shaping process for him. And she did it so softly and so gently, he was almost unaware that it was happening. And then this master teacher kind of was a strike of lightning for him. But he describes it as the formless. And that word stuck out to me because, as we well know, the word form has a vast wealth of meaning for the adult that this child will become. So to hear him speak of this teacher using formless, and how this teacher took a formless being and molded him with focus and purpose. And what I hear Louis saying is this was the bedrock. This was the foundation upon which so much of what I became lies. And so I think that this is super impactful thing for him. And it was also, by the way, he loves botany, which is kind of cool. It's like, So it's that buds and gets them. There's a section in chapter 9 that I don't entirely understand its purpose for being in there, but there's a little segue about before class begins. He goes off on a 10-day camping excursion.
Let me come back to before you go into that, I want to talk a little bit about Moses Wilson. Let me tell you how I think about it. And I think it's a radical change in him. So in order to understand the change, you have to look at what he already had before and what is it that he did not have. And after this, what is it that he had? How did it leverage what he already had? And what are the new things that he got? So that's how I'm thinking of it. He had this boundless curiosity for the world. He already had that. He had the ability of actually listening to the world, taking in everything from everybody, all of nature, all of creation of human beings, all human beings. He was very open to taking all of that in. So in terms of life breaking in upon him, he already had that commitment to doing that, and he would keep growing in that. But in terms of breaking out, his ability is limited because he's still taking in stuff, but he doesn't really know how to speak at that level, at the level which will do justice to what he's taking in. What Moses Wilson does is that essentially he gives him discipline, which is consonant with his curiosity. See, It's not just discipline, because the church was trying to give him discipline. His old schools were trying to give him discipline. And all those disciplines were actually destructive to taking in stuff. They were simply saying, do this. What Moses Wilson is doing is something grander, and he sees that immediately. He's saying that you need to produce stuff. You actually need to speak in a way that does justice to what you're hearing and what you're seeing. You need to create something that does justice to what you're seeing. That requires, I like the word concentration. That requires concentration. You need the ability to bring all of that in. So what he's essentially giving him over a period of months is the discipline of systematically taking in things, reasoning about it, producing things, checking them. That method of actually dealing with the whole, being completely open and producing stuff. So that's, I think, the heart of it. And it is huge. And it's great that he sees it instantly. Instantly he sees, this is what I need. And moment he realizes this is what I need to do what he just like, otherwise he has all kinds of complaints about his teachers and other people. Here he says, that's what I need. Okay, I need to stop, I really need to get this. And then just like when he discovers the value of books, he goes after that. Here he goes after something far more fundamental of actually building the discipline, self-discipline. He puts it in terms of self-discipline for self-power, because you need that in order to fully speak, that, breaking out from inside, you need that. So that's what I see Moses Wilson giving him. What do you think?
I agree 1,000%. Yes, that's great. So I wish I could find a quote, because that's exactly what he uses, the self-power, self-discipline. That's the same one where he talks about formless. I didn't highlight it, but yes, that's absolutely it. He does have a single-mindedness of, I do love that. He goes, this is what I need. And it's kind of the awe with which he approached all the things in nature. This was the first time we're seeing it from a teacher, because he just didn't feel that way about any others.
And I want to make another observation about what you said about the grandfather. See, the grandfather is a critical character in all of this. He's not a teacher himself. Okay, so for example, you to note, I noticed that Louis Sullivan is so precise in evaluating people. He says, Moses Wilson is not a deep thinker. What he is that he's a great teacher. He's helping his students become human beings. He's teaching them how to process information. He doesn't himself have deep ideas. Okay, so his grandfather is not a teacher. He's not kind of explicitly saying, okay, I'm going to communicate this to you, which is what Moses Wilson is doing. But he's doing something critical. He's actually giving him like almost a meta feedback at critical points in his life. He's observing him, he's seeing his learning process, and he's giving him critical feedback. He's warning him about typical pitfalls that happen. He's again not telling him you should do this, don't do this. No, he's not doing that. He's saying it's possible, it's possible that you can go this way or that way. He's putting those in front of him and then again stepping back. So I really think, that grandfather is providing him with a feedback at a remote level in a very gentle way, at the same time, very clear way. So I really love the interaction between the grandfather. But please go on to the next point.
So I just wanted to briefly talk about his 10-day camping.
Yes.
Just because it was it's interesting in that he starts it off by saying that he describes the two boys he's going with, and like he describes them as being far more suited to such a trip than he was, but he wants to do it anyway. And yet they, you know, it seems like it's one of the first like 10-day experiences he has by himself without his family. And he seems very impressed with himself that he portrayed himself so well. And he was able to keep up with these two people whom he thought were so much superior to them. And there's a guide, but he makes that guide seem almost as an immaterial. And it made me think of, how when there's like the one chaperone adult and the kids like to pretend that chaperone is not there. I suspect that's kind of the way that trip went down. I feel like it helped to frame the headspace in which he found himself when he sat down and, Moses Woosley walked into his life. Because like he had already had his trials in nature, and he was in a space, and it was such a sharp contrast. To me, I feel like the camping trip was a concentration of his solitary meanderings and observations of nature. Like in this one, it was a purposeful outing with nature, which I really don't think we had, with the exception of the ones he had done with his grandfather. This was the first one by himself. So that to me was really interesting. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear some of you guys take on how you think that put him in the frame of mind for when he went to school. I'd be curious if anyone had any thoughts on that.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Maritza. Next up is Rupali. Oh, no, sorry. Next up is Rob and then Rupali.
There you go.
There you go. We're unmuted. Excellent. So
Wait a second.
I had just enough time to read the part about Moses Wilson. So I have a few things to say about that. And I think the crucial thing here, the really interesting point he's making here is about, it's clearly a big impact this guy has. And it's about this statement. Hold on, I just lost it here. Here we go. After this first introduction to Moses Wilson, where he says, I have this plan and you boys are going to do this and we're going to have, sets out these big, vast ambitions. Louis felt the hour of freedom was at hand. Now, the guy's talking about discipline, how you have to listen and you have to say strict attention, all that. Why is he talking about this as the hour of freedom? So he continues, he saw with inward glowing that true freedom could only come through discipline of power. And he translated the master's words of discipline into its true intent. Self-discipline of self-power. His eager life was to condense now in a focusing of powers. All right, and what did this all mean? But powers of his own, obscurely mingled, uncoordinated, and thus far vain to create. So he's been talking all this time about man's power to do and man's power to create. And what he's realizing now is for his own power to coordinate together and for him to be able to do something and create something, he needs the self-discipline to bring those powers together and to focus them. And he sees that as what he's going to get out of this class. And I think he puts his grandfather's words in there saying, well, we'll see if the real matches the ideal here, to show that, it's an open question whether this plan as initially stated is actually going to come through. But he finds that's exactly what happens. So one of the things I find interesting about this is that he talks a little bit about Moses Wilson's actual plan for instruction. But I think the most important thing here is the ambitiousness of it. The idea that, there's a phrase that George W. Bush made famous. He talked about the soft bigotry of low expectations. The idea is that, if the damage you're doing to somebody, if you come in with low expectations for them, and say, we don't expect you to do very much, And if you do that, then they're not going to do very much. Whereas, I think the only class, when I look back on my own education, the experiences I had that were somewhat similar to Louis were the ones where, I had a history in high school of doing poorly in classes that were easy and excelling in classes that were hard, because the class that was hard calls upon you to give, what is it? I'm going to give everything I have to you, and I'm going to expect you to give everything back in return. And that when a teacher does that, you sit up and you listen and you give a lot more. And when challenged, you will produce a great deal more than when you're not. So I think it's simply the ambitiousness of it, the challenge of it, the requirement that you're going to have to do a lot, that gives him that focus and that motivation to really apply himself to his work in a way he hadn't done before. But then the second thing that I took away from Moses Wilson was, and so he talks as a result, he was becoming stronger and surer of himself, right? This is the result of working hard and applying yourself, is that you begin to grow in your own powers. But the second part of it that Wilson seems to project is his enthusiasm for the topic, for every topic he's talking about. So he talks about how the curriculum would end with a lecture by Wilson, and he talks glowingly of these lectures. And the primary thing is, let's see if I can find the right one here. It was in the nature studies and in these closing lectures, particularly those in which he dwelt upon the great out of doors and upon the glories of English literature, that the deep enthusiasms of the man's nature came forth undisguised and unrestrained, rising often to the heights of impassioned eloquence and beauteous awakening imagery. These lectures, or rather informal talks, covered a wide range of subjects, most of them lying beyond the boundaries of the school curriculum. Thus, in a sense, Moses Wilson's schoolroom partook of the nature of a university. So it's the idea that this boundless enthusiasm for all of human knowledge being brought together, that also, I think, sort of galvanizes the young Louis, that it's sort of there's sort of in the discipline and enthusiasm part, there's sort of the carrot, the stick and the carrot, right? So the negative part is, I'm going to demand a great deal of you. The positive part is, I'm demanding so much because I have this incredible enthusiasm for all the amazing things there are out there to learn. And that's the positive part of sort of attracting the student toward all this effort by showing, look at the reward. You get to understand all these big, all these different things out there in the world that you need to understand. And so here we get at the end, and somehow this is blocked off with like a green pen.
It's another green line.
There's a green line in the side. By the end of the school year, Moses Wilson, through genius as a teacher, had turned a crudely promising boy into, so to speak, a mental athlete. He had brought order out of disorder, definition out of what was vague, superb alertness out of mere boyish ardor, had nurtured and concentrated all that was best in the boy, had made him consciously courageous and independent, had focused his powers of thought, feeling, and action, had confirmed Louis's love of the great out of doors as a source of inspiration, and had climaxed all by parting a great veil which opened to the view of the same boy, the wonderland of poetry. Thus, with great skill, he made of Louis a compacted personality, ready to act on his own initiative in an intelligent, purposeful way. Now, notice that we had at the beginning of this, he said he saw this great opening of freedom, but the talk was all about discipline. Well, now we get to what he means by why he said freedom about that, which is that what he gets is, where was it here? That all this, the development of his powers through the self-discipline have made him consciously courageous and independent, and that it had made him ready to act on his own initiative. So he realized that in order to be independent, I have to then engage in all this disciplined work so I can focus my powers and have those powers ready to use for my own purposes. So that's how it is that you get self-discipline as the key to self-power, which is the theme he established earlier. And so that's what I found fascinating about this particular chapter.
I think we all remember that teacher that demanded the most of us.
Yeah, I had a few of them.
Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. I was hoping that you would pick up on this because I really wanted to hear your thoughts on this. It's wonderful. I'm going to actually read the quote that you started out with, and I'm going to continue reading because I think it makes he explicitly says, you have all these powers, but they're kind of going in all directions. They're not focused. And what Moses does is that he gives him a way of focusing the powers through discipline that enables him to kind of get to a level of, I think the self-power, I think captures it. He's able to produce now for the first time. Louis felt the hour of freedom was at hand. He saw with inward glowing that true freedom could only come through discipline of power. And he translated the master's word of discipline into its true intent, self-discipline of self-power. His eager life was to condense now in a focusing of powers. What had the words meant? Silence, attention, promptness, speed, accurate, observe, reflect, discriminate, but the powers of his own obscurely mingled, uncoordinated, and thus far vain to create. He captures it so beautifully. Now, in the master's plan, which he saw as a ground plan, he beheld that for which in the darkness of broad daylight, he had yearned so desperately in vain, that for which, as it were, with empty, outstretched hands, he had grasped, vaguely groping, as one seeing through a film, that for which he had hungered with an aching heart, as empty as his hands. So this point about that his hands are empty. So there is all of this thing is coming onto his hands, coming onto his heart, but he doesn't have the language to speak. What Moses is giving him is actually the grammar to speak, to actually put it together in a way where you can actually start creating. He had not known, surely, what it was he wished to find. But when the master breathed the words that Louis felt to be inspired, "You are here as wards in my charge. I accept that charge as sacred. I accept the responsibility involved as a high exacting duty I owe to myself and equally to you. I will give to you all that I have, and you shall give me all that you have." A veil was parted, as it were by magic, and behold, there stood forth not alone a man, but a teacher of the young. So, I mean, this is the kind of beginning. I think this is a turning point because this is beginning of breaking out. Because breaking out is not just wish to break out. The wish comes before. He already had that. But you need to actually learn the language to bring everything that you're grasping in a form where you can start expressing yourself. It's like the beginning of the art of expression. So I think it's amazing. I also thought that the structure of his class to be fascinating, where has this first part, which is about taking in and mastering things, mostly training of the memory. Then you have kind of natural observation, and then there is a free-form lecture, and you're doing that every day. So you're seeing that you have to build up these skills. It is tedious. It is hard work. Then you have some part where there is more kind of little bit more back and forth, but still some structure. And then last part, which is unstructured, not just unstructured, but you're seeing where can this go? So you're learning about what English literature can be, what outdoors can be. Why are you doing all of this work? So that entire thing being repeated day after day after day. So it's just amazing. Thank you. Thank you, Rob. I'm just delighted that you focused on that. Next up is Rupali.
It's, I'm going to, I think I'm going to talk about the journey. And when Louis Sullivan starts this chapter 8 with Louis goeth on a journey, he's talking about his journey from boyhood to adolescence. And we are all talking about, how he is developing into the young man that he's going to become. So this is the age between 12 to 16. And, having a great teacher during this time is amazing, because this is the age when children are developing their personality. And Rob, you did a fantastic job of talking about how that actually happens. And this is also a time when, let me just get to the page again. So the adolescent to adult age is very important when children get into high school, right? And so that's the age when children need stability. They also need rigor, because they can do a lot, they can achieve a lot. So somebody who expects rigor in terms of their academic work, in terms of their physical work, and then discipline, which is going to build their character, their personality. Children at this age are driven by ambition, and we hope that they're driven by ambition at this time. That they seek knowledge, and all of this builds. All these skills are built during these years between 12 to 16, when they're in middle school and high school. And what a good teacher does is basically guides them through this journey. So I'm actually going to read a little bit of Louis Sullivan's description of a teacher from Kindergarten Chats, where he says, "We need men of large hearts, luminous minds, rich sympathies, men who can grasp the significance of youth and social value of democracy and of creative art." So those are the good qualities. Those are the qualities of a teacher. So you need a teacher who's going to inspire, who's going to understand at the same time where the child is in its plane of development. So at one point, Louis Sullivan talks about how Moses Wilson gives him all this description, and then he is flooded by light and he cannot see anything at all. But then he brings it down to his level. So to keep in mind that adolescent children are not adults yet, and they still, remember what the grandfather said, is still very tender at this age. Emotionally, they are all over the place, and to have an anchor in a great teacher is very good. So it also reminds me of, I'm sorry about that. It also reminds me of Maria Montessori's work in the book Formation of Man, where she talks about this age group where you have to give help during this age group in order that human personality may achieve its independence. So here a child is now truly, becoming an independent being. And it means that you have to deliver.
Rupali, can I make a very small, quick point?
Yeah.
One of the rules that I really caught my attention is that a raised hand will always get attention.
Yes.
All the other rules are saying, okay, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to keep quiet, but if you have something and you raise your hand, it will always get attention.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it also, I'll come to some of the stories in a bit. But Maria Montessori talks about, that you have, so in the book Formation of Man, she talks about to deliver the human personality, you must free the child from the oppression of age-old prejudices regarding education. and to believe that human personality belongs to all human beings, that these concern and affect the humans of all nations. So all children around the world are the same. They have the same basic needs, and we are so um, used to looking at education and through a particular lens that when you come across a teacher like Moses Wilson, you feel, wow, he is a man from another time, that he talks about uh, Moses Wilson in that manner. She also says, where does human personality begin? What is human personality? When does a man become a human being? The human personality is one during successive stages of its development. All of us grow from childhood to adulthood. Therefore, education must be based on the principle that regards all stages of human development. And I feel that this quote from Maria Montessori is so applicable to this book, The Autobiography of an Idea, because Louis Sullivan spends a lot of time talking about his childhood experiences, because these childhood experiences are going to shape the adult man that he is going to be. And he reminds us in a previous chapter that what the child accepts, the adult accepts. What the child rejects, the adult rejects. This is how we shape ourselves. And so having a great teacher during this time is helpful. And he talks about his grandfather. We've talked about his grandfather. I want to kind of go back to what his grandfather says, what should not be a teacher. Because we've talked about a good teacher, and I just want to go back to, he says, have your teachers ever told you anything of value about a river? Any river? Have they ever told you that there are rivers and rivers, each with its special character? Have they ever given you a word picture of a river so that you might at least summon an image of it, however short of reality? They have not. They cannot. They are not inspired. They are victims of routine, wearied on the daily treadmill until they can no longer see into the heart of child. And so on one end, you have teachers who are so uninspired that they cannot inspire a child. And on the other hand, you have examples like Moses Wilson, who can really bring the joy of learning, who can really inspire the child to say, I can do this. So I want to share a quick story. So currently we are teaching children in Asia on our online platform. And it's the approach is that of team teaching. So we have a teacher who works on organization, discipline. And when we say discipline, it's not punishment. It's more like, and it's not like what Shrikant, you said, keep quiet or this or that, but being aware of yourself, being present, taking charge of your emotions and regulating them. So we have this one particular middle school student who was very fidgety and has been labeled and identified with all sorts of disabilities. And when he's been working with the teachers, and every time he starts the class, the teacher says, well, remove your swivel chair, because this is all he could do as he would sit in the class. And the teacher would say, bring a wooden chair. And so every time, that was the first thing, take your swivel chair away and get a wooden chair and sit on it. And initially, first 3 lessons, he argued and said, but, and the teacher said very firmly that get a wooden chair. When you're ready, you can move back to the swivel chair. So 2 months later, a few days ago, he said to the teacher, as soon as he came in, he was sitting in a swivel chair. And he said, I'm going to sit in the swivel chair and I'm going to pay attention. And the teacher immediately said, well, I see you're ready. Tell me your strategy for sitting, paying attention. And he said, I'm going to sit straight. I'm going to sit with my shoulders back. I'm going to have good posture. I'm going to be aware of what you're saying. I'm going to make eye contact, look at the camera. I'm not going to play with my fingers. And she said, well, during the lesson, how are you going to be aware of yourself And he said, well, I'm going to look at myself, but then I'm also going to be aware mentally where I am. And so immediately the teacher said, sure, you are ready to use this, we will check. So the thing is, what teachers like Moses Wilson do, or a great teacher does, is they identify what the goal is for the child. Where is this child's journey? And help the child along the path by really looking at the individual, that one size does
Rupali,
not.
can I interrupt again?
Yes.
Okay. This principle of are you ready? The
Mhm.
teacher asking the student is a very deep principle. So for example, in the Indian story of Arjun and Dronacharya, where there is, they have been learning for years, and this is the time for the final test of archery. And so the way in which the test is done is the student walks up and the teacher asks him, are you ready to take the test? And the children, and it's an open question. And the student is welcome to say, no, I'm not ready. In which case the teacher says, okay, fine, let's go to the next person. So only when the student is ready, you go forward.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you see that in kindergarten chats, and you also see in this chapter with Moses Wilson that um, Louis Sullivan is ready to to accept the work that Moses Wilson is going to assign him. Yeah, so that's one thing. The other thing that I wanted to talk about was, and I'll come back to Moses Wilson and his method of teaching because there's a lot over there. But I also want to talk about a little bit of who Louis Sullivan is becoming. Now we've seen him since his childhood, that he was a curious child, intelligent, ready to take in, very has a growth mindset, is ambitious. He is a healthy boy. He is able to go out and about and do experiments. He has this love for nature. He loves his mighty men. Um, and as Sherri pointed out, that he even personifies uh, the nature and buildings and bridges uh, as if they are people talking to each other, right? And so now he's also looking at his those are all the concrete things in his life. As he is now studying in this high school, those concrete ideas are becoming more abstract. They're taking an abstract form in the form of mathematics, algebra, botany. And he has a very interesting description of how he looks at algebra and botany. One of our teachers, when she teaches math, she often says, well, I want to welcome you to the city of multiplicity. And there are numbers in the city. Would you like to discover these numbers? And which child would not want to do that? And so, of course, when this teacher, she starts with the city of multiplicity, children are naturally intrigued. And so when I was reading Louis Sullivan's description of algebra, he says, it reminded me of that teacher. He says, to him, the symbol X flashed at once as a key to the unknown but ascertainable. Standing alone, he viewed this X in surprise as a mystic spirit in a land of enchantment, opening vistas so deep he could not see the end, and his vivid imagination saw at once that this X, expanded in its latent power, might prove the key to turn a lock in a door within a wall which shut out the truth he was seeking, the truth which might dissolve from him the mystery that lay behind appearances. For this X, he saw, was manipulated by means of things unknown. So, again, a very beautiful description of mathematics. And, we often hear him saying before, what is behind this? I want to discover, I want to solve this mystery. And so now he's looking at algebra, at math as that. The other thing he talks about is the powers, right? And he talks about the power of
Okay,
imagination.
sorry, Rupali. Can
Go
I?
ahead, please. Go on.
Okay, this is a huge point. Okay, because going from arithmetic to algebra, that X is actually going to conceptual level. Concrete things of just counting 1, 2, 3, that is all arithmetic, that is all about percepts. There is one sheep, the level of abstraction is very low. Moment you say X and start especially to see relationships between X, regardless of what that X is, that is equivalent. This is, Ayn Rand's core point in objectivist epistemology, that when you come to X, it's the same as going from percepts to concepts. So I really love his description of saying, this is a power. I don't know exactly what it is going to do. I don't know how it's going to pan out, but there is something this is a very deep and enormously powerful power here. Thank you.
Great. So the other thing that he talks about is his love for botany. And we all know how much he loved his trees. Those trees belong to him, and everything in nature belongs to Louis Sullivan. So here now he's actually studying botany as a subject. And he says, as to botany, had he not always seen trees and shrubs and vines and flowers of the field, the orchard and the garden? Now he was learning their true story, their most secret intimacies, and the organization of their love, of their world. He loved them all more for this. So now he can really understand all the questions that he had asked when he first enjoyed spring and looked at all these flowers and trees and became aware of their being. Then he goes on to talk about literature and how literature moves him. I want to share a story about my father's schooling. So my father loves to tell the story. He went to a local language school, a Marathi medium school, because that was the language that he spoke at home. And when he was in middle school, he had an English teacher. And much like Louis Sullivan describes, my father describes this teacher quite vividly. And he said, this teacher would not teach English from a book. He would say to the students, get an English paper, get an English magazine, find an article, just a paragraph that you like, read the article, write it in your own words in English, and then bring it to the class and we'll share. And then in the classroom, there was open discussion. So children would stand up and talk about their paragraphs. And he said, we just became great friends because the students understood each other's interests. Somebody was interested in sports, somebody was interested in art, somebody was interested in poetry. And so because of that, he said the classroom just became a very interactive social unit. And then they could learn about many more subjects than just what was in the textbook. So I know that Rob had read this point about how at the end of the day, they had these lectures that didn't just have a limitation of the curriculum, but it went above and beyond that to expand his horizons. So when Louis Sullivan says, I went on a journey, he's expanding his horizons, even mentally, not just, knowing the geography of the land and his relationships, his social structure, everything during this middle school, high school years is expanding for him and very truly for all children at that age group. So having these delightful lectures helps the students. Another thing he talks about about his teacher, right? Who was Moses Wilson? And he says, impartial in judgment, fertile in illustration and expedient, clear in statement, he opened to view a new world, a new land of enchantment. So again, in Montessori, most of these big picture lessons are told as stories because children have a higher level of imagination. They can imagine at a much higher level than they can read or write or do their math and science. So both Louis Sullivan and Maria Montessori recognize that. And I want to share a particular story. So we have a student on our online platform from Asia who started just about a month ago. And as an 11th grader, she decided to quit school. And school was just not working for her. Her teachers would pick on her because they knew that every time they asked a question, she wouldn't know the answer. And they could say, look, you're not studying. She couldn't finish her projects on time. She was overwhelmed and so on and so forth. But then she joined our online platform. And again, we have this team teaching where one teacher works on executive function, skills, organization, and all of that, kind of just walking her through who she is, helping her discover who she is, what her interests are. And then we have David Malinsky, whom you've met, who does all, what David does is he applies all the things that this other teacher kind of articulates for the child, but he doesn't apply it by saying, now I'm going to teach you an executive function skill. Now I'm going to teach you this. He just does it as, here's a big picture. So when they read books, even on the online platform for middle school and high school students, David reads aloud the passages. So children can read at their own level. And they're currently reading Ayn Rand's Anthem, and that can be dark at some points. But when he reads it, it just comes to life, and they can understand the emotions. And so, reading aloud, making the world of words come alive for children is important. And I think most parents do that when children are younger, but then to help to do that when they are older is also important. So this child, for 4 weeks, she's like, she started with, no, I can't do this assignment. And slowly the teachers encouraged, no judgment, impartial, but saying, you can do this. We know you have this potential. And she wrote a poem. I wish I had it with me. They're studying haiku at the same time. So she wrote this poem about a pigeon flying away, and she took a picture of this pigeon on her terrace where the sun and the shadow, and she talks about this bird taking flight from its own shadow. And so, now you can see that children can really imagine at a much higher level. And when all of the other students in this online class from different countries, they clapped and they said, yay, wow, that's beautiful. Suddenly her confidence went up, and she said to her father, I can't believe that people actually want to hear my thoughts, and they want to listen to me. So the thing is, what a good teacher does, they bring out that personality. They help the child kind of say, this is who you are, and you have it in you. Everything is in you. So what Louis Sullivan talks about, all these powers reside in every human being, and that it's up to the teacher to kind of bring those to surface, almost like polishing a stone to make it shine. So that was another thing I wanted to talk about. So going back to man's powers, now we've seen this intuition, that an instinct that Louis Sullivan has had since he was a little child. Whenever he discovers something, he says, there is this power, and sometimes he can articulate it and sometimes he cannot articulate it, but he knows intuitively. And for him, the great thing is that he does not let go of his intuition and instinct as he is growing up. Usually this imagination, intuition is kind of beaten out by, this is how you study, here's the formula, here is how you're going to write a 5-paragraph essay. I mean, yes, you need that structure, but behind that structure is the human's own personal intuition of what things are. So you can start see in this chapter, he's able to articulate those powers, And if I'll go back to kindergarten chats where he says, what are man's powers? Man's powers means simply what man can do, his physical powers, his mental nature, um, his power of feeling, of emotion, great powers of his inner life. Therefore, the poet, the powers to vision forth. Hence, he is a dreamer of dreams. And we see how many, even, we know that he likes to daydream. We've seen that in his school where he was daydreaming and not paying attention to the classes. He's dreaming of ideas, but she is the one who says, if you're dreaming, dream of joyful things. So to dream and to visualize his thinking, his speculation and work. He talks about the power of man to will. And we saw that in Sherri's description of the engine has the power, the man has the power, the mountains say we will. Everyone has that will. And then finally, he talks about the power of love, which we've talked about last time. It is the, capacity to be compassionate, and how he sees the world as a compassionate human being, nature, and that man is part of this world. So I think, we can go on and on about what Louis Sullivan talks. There's so much packed in this chapter. I do want to go back to the structure that Shrikant talked about. So the structure of how children learn is so important. Perhaps you've discussed this in the Meetup on flow. And I can also talk a little bit about how Maria Montessori thought about the structure of the classroom. And similar to Moses Wilson, the big part where your mental abilities require to focus is done in the mornings. So in a Montessori classroom, you typically start the day with the big picture ideas. So children, and it's more like a Socratic conversation where children are free to ask questions and share their thoughts about an idea. And then after that, now that they are awake, or they are sensitive to learning, so everything about their sleepy morning routines or whatever was going outside the classroom is behind them, they are ready to work. They get into uninterrupted work time. So it's a chunk of time, about 3 hours every morning, where they can choose any work they like, whether it's language, history, geography, math, science, research. They can just focus on that work as long as they need. And there's the whole drama, or of taking the work off the shelf, laying it out, the physical components of it, very tactile, sensory, and then actually doing the work with deep focus. And it's almost like a crescendo. And then when that work is done, the child puts the work away, takes a little break, gets up, walks, gets a drink of water, chats with other people, comes back to another work. And so there's that flow of deep thinking, deep work in the mornings. Then we have lunch and recess, and that's when there's free, unstructured play. So most Montessori schools don't have like a structured playtime, and it's just let the children come up with their own games, and that's when they negotiate. They have all these social interactions which are important for developing their personality. And then in the afternoon are studio hours, whether they are doing technology or learning music or are in an art studio. So that's when you're going above and beyond your curriculum. You're thinking of big ideas, you're imagining ideas, and then creating something that is real. So Montessori education, the whole idea is hands-on experiences with real life outcomes. And so that's what we see in Mr. Wilson's class. And that's what makes learning so fun for Louis Sullivan. So often when we go out and about, so our school is in a city, and our children are from kindergarten to grade 8. And we take them to the local art museum every week to do our art lessons. We take them to a maker space to learn technology and use tools. They, even in kindergarten, they can use hammers and drills and saws and things like that. And so often we hear all these partners saying to us, we don't do these exercises or activities with other students. We just can't trust them. But with your students, we can trust them. And the question is, why can't they trust these students? And the reason is the teachers spend September, the month of September, just building discipline. And again, discipline is, how do you conduct yourself? How do you walk? How do you talk? How do you present yourself? How do you follow instructions? And it is done in a very natural, with natural way, without saying you must be quiet, or and then raise your hand when you want to speak, is a very common thing that you would hear in a Montessori classroom. Or that the child will put their hand, if they are interrupting a conversation, they just put their hand on the teacher's shoulder. But this whole structure that he learns from Mr. Wilson right at the beginning, that you will be silent, you will pay strict attention, no moving of your papers or anything. You will be alert and listen in silence with your whole mind, not part of it, to listen with your whole heart, not part of it. For sound listening is the basis of sound thinking. Sympathetic listening is the basis for sympathetic, worthwhile thinking. Accurate listening is the basis for accurate thinking. Finally, you are here to observe, to reflect, to discriminate. It is not to be approached with due. I will not comment upon it now. It is not to be approached with due preparation. So learning to observe, to reflect, and to discriminate, those are higher thinking skills, and they need to prepare the mind of the child, to prepare the child to be able to do those things. Then he also stresses the matters of hygiene, and that a raised hand would always have attention. So this structure is important for children. And we see this even on campus as well as online, that having expectations and holding children accountable to those expectations really helps children understand the boundaries. So in Montessori, we call it freedom within limits. You have these limits, and within that, you can be free to do, and children want those limits. I often ask he says that this is the teacher he responded to. And I think many of us ask that question, why do we respond to teachers who have high expectations, who set the bar high? Why don't we respond to teachers who set the bar low? And that's exactly the question I have written, is why would you not respond to teachers, parents, or other adults who see themselves as the child's friend, and not as an educator, not as somebody who sets the bar high. So the thing is, children love limits. When they know these are my boundaries, then they know how far they'll test those boundaries, they'll push those boundaries, and then they are comfortable and say, okay, this is the area I can work in. This is the area I can find my freedom to do what I want. And then they are at peace to do the work that they are meant to do. So with that, I'll end my my talk.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. This was great. Now, I'm going to call upon anybody who wants to talk about what they got from the chapters, these two chapters, or the presentation. So Evanik, Jyoti, Ever, or NA. If you'd like to share, Evanik, go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you once again to everybody. Everybody did a wonderful job per the usual. One of the things that really struck me was his teacher, Moses. Like he had other teachers, but the other teachers just didn't do it for him. Like they just couldn't tap into what he needed. And I think when I first was reading the chapter 9, and I was in Louis Sullivan was going through everything that the teacher was saying, I thought before I got to the end that he was going to hate him. Like I was expecting a very negative view. And then he was like, this is the guy, this is the teacher, this is one of the great teachers that gave me self-discipline, that helped me to grow, that led me to, pursue, the university, and that without him, he couldn't have done this. Without him, Louis Sullivan wouldn't have been the man that he is today, is because of that discipline. And I think sometimes, like when we're looking at teaching and, or education of anybody, we always look towards, well, it's kind of like a freedom, but there's also a discipline that has to come along with that freedom. And I think Louis Sullivan really describes that perfectly. It's like, this, out of discipline comes that freedom, because now you can focus on what you were learning and how you were learning it. But there is a discipline, there is a definite need to pay attention, and there's a definite need. And when it's something that you want, or something that you want to learn, particularly with Louis Sullivan and botany and all of that, if it's something that you truly want to learn, you will discipline yourself. You will do that for yourself, and you will learn. And one of the things I remember is, like, always the best teachers are the teachers that demanded the best out of you, that knew your best, and they demanded no less than your best selves. Those are the teachers that make a difference. So that was like my main takeaway.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Evanique. Next up is Jyoti. Jyoti, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm going to make it short too, because I know you have another meetup. This presentation, as usual, was marvelous. It was fabulous. You all captured all the good things that I read, and I said, and I, lined them up, and I said, okay, this is great. I'm sure they're going to take it up. So you did that. Each one of you did that, and then Shrikant came up with his explanations and descriptions and what have you of the Moses Wilson, and how the mind works, how it processes information, and what have you. However, you guys did not touch what I'm going to touch. Some morbidity. He lost his grandmother, and he had such matured reactions and things to say that I was blown away, because I had a recent death too. So I'm just going to read just a few lines. Louise was forbidden her room, the grandmother's room. All was quiet, furtive comings and goings, whispered anxious words. The cloud rose, darkened the world, and passed on. One morning, he was told that he, Louis, might see her. He went directly to her room, opened the door, and entered. The white shades were down, and all the light was within. On the bed, he saw extended an object fully covered by a sheet. He advanced, drew aside the sheet, rashly pressed his lips upon the cold forehead, drew back as though stung. Standing erect, he gazed steadfastly down upon rigid features that seemed of unearthly ivory. Grandma had vanished. What signified this cold menace he now scanned? This stranger in the house, whence grandma had gone forever. What meant this effigy, this ivory simulacrum that had come here in her stead? It could not see, it could not hear, it could not feel, it could not move, it could not speak, it could not love. Grandma had vanished. His true grandma was in his heart. Now I'm going to cut down a little bit. His true grandma was in his heart, and he would remain there till his own end should come. Whatever this object before him might be, it was not grandma, it was a counterfeit. He replaced the shroud, dried-eyed, as one filled with the cold light. He left the room. Never before had Lois seen what death, the cloud no bigger than a man's hand, leaves behind it as it passes overhead and vanishes. And I thought his reaction to death was really out of this world. He was a little grown by that time, but still, how could he just derive all that his grandma had vanished? This effigy will never talk, will never say anything, the lips will never move. It was like how those things came in his mind and how he quickly, which I always say, goes to another compartment, but she will stay in my heart. She'll be here as long as I live. And I thought that was also very descriptive of how his mind works. And I would say that, in the psychology, the cognition, there's something called inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning. And in his case, I said, it runs simultaneously. It doesn't take too much time to deduce from what he has taken in. And he'll quickly come up with some logic. And that is, like you said, your school, you give them freedom to learn and to express and what have you. I mean, you would have really enjoyed a student like Louis Sullivan. He would have been a great candidate for your school. Well, thank you. You all did such a good job. This is long sitting for me because I have sciatic problems now, but I try to sit in completely in those where I know I am in flow. And today and always in this, I am in flow. Thank you.
Thank you, Jyoti. I thought that was a fantastic, thank you for bringing that up. I just want to make one comment and then hand it over to Sherri. I see form follows function here. She's saying what is left here is just the form. It has no function in it. And the function was to love, was to be, and that is integral part of him now. So the grandmother actually lives in him. So I thought that was beautiful. Sherri, followed by Rupali.
Yeah, Jyoti, thank you so much for reading that so beautifully. I had thought about bringing that same line up, but I would not have been able to read it. So thank you for doing such a beautiful job. And Shrikant too, you're right. It is really one of those elements of form follows function right there. And it is, I mean, I know we're reading here his reaction as he's writing it as an adult of what his reaction was as a child. But there had to have been part of that was very much true, that he was told he would see his grandmother. But that wasn't his grandmother.
Yes.
So that must have really, really hit at that age. Quite remarkable.
Wonderful. So now closing thoughts, starting with Rupali.
So I just wanted to say, Jyoti, thank you for bringing that up. I actually had marked it for next week because for the next time to talk, because there's a change happening in next chapter. And I wanted to kind of focus on the education bit, but you're absolutely right. This is part of life, and how Louis Sullivan embraces it is really good. I want to go back to the teachers and education, and I want to say that, physicians, when they become doctors, have to take a Hippocratic oath, and they have to make a vow to do no harm. So I'm going to say that this part should be the Hippocratic oath for all teachers, and our teachers are coming back on Monday, and I think I'm going to use this. So here it says, "You are here as wards in my charge. I accept that charge as sacred. I accept the responsibility involved as a high exacting duty I owe to myself and equally to you. I will give to you all that I have. You shall give to me all that you have." I think every teacher should say that.
Beautiful, beautiful. Thank you. Thank you, Rupali. Right. Any closing thoughts, Sherri or Maritza?
Because we don't have Joia with us today, I have to read one little chapter, not chapter, oh dear, no, one little paragraph, because I couldn't read this without Joia's voice in my head now. So this is when Sullivan is talking about all the different courses that he's taking. And of course, it's the English literature. So English literature opened to him the great world of words, of ordered speech, the marvelous vehicle whereby we're conveyed every human thought and feeling from mind to mind, from heart to heart, from soul to soul, from imagination to imagination, from thought to thought, and to his ever-widening view, it soon arose before him as a vast treasure house wherein was stored in huge accumulation a record of thoughts, the deeds, the hopes, the joys, the sorrows, and the triumphs of mankind.
Thank you. Maritza.
Yep.
I feel like I was kind of all over the place for this one. There are so many aspects and pieces, and you're invoked that, Joia, there's also a section where he talks about how poetry was open to him because of Moses Woodson. So that I thought that was interesting. She would have probably talked about that. And so what came to mind here is that what we see in chapter 9 in this book is a embodiment of the definition of the autotelic personality, as we've been discussing in a session of flow. I find it interesting. There's a quote here that says, and this is in flow and under the conditions of flow, and it says, when adversity threatens to paralyze us, we need to reassert control by finding a new direction in which to invest psychic energy, a direction that lies outside the reach of external forces. And I find it remarkable that Louis Sullivan at such a young age has such an amazing ability to do that. And he even talks about how he's confounded by how weak his grandfather, who he regards as this great man, is so seemingly weak in the face of the death of his grandmother, because he's dissolved into tears and wailing, and while he's stoic and he's unmoved, he's not creating tears. And so I find that to be just an interesting glimpse of he calls it the power to will. I thought that was interesting.
Thank you. Sherri, closing thoughts.
Yeah, just one last little detail that I wanted to make sure we all pointed out. Right at the very end of this chapter we're talking about, we have Louis Sullivan taking a shift from high school to tech school. And this is a critically important thing coming up. And at the very last paragraph of these two chapters we read, we have the very short little snippet that feels like just a short little snippet. Well, it's not. It says here, this last paragraph, it should be mentioned that at the time of the Great Chicago Fire, Louis received prompt word from the family that they were safe and sound and beyond the reaches of its fearsome ravages. So we have that as a really important part of who he was. He wasn't in Chicago. His family was when this massive fire takes place. So we've got some pretty exciting couple of chapters coming up here. Are we doing two again? Is that
we'll
it?
do two. Yeah, we'll do two. And
Okay.
what I'll do is that, given that so many people have talked about what Joia would have said, I'm going to invite her to comment on these two chapters if she wants.
Yes.
As well.
I think that's great.
All right. Thank you very much, folks. We'll see you 2 weeks from today.